For over 60 years, Americans have been told one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, acted alone. But what if that story was crafted to hide a darker truth? What if the real assassins were protected by those sworn to defend the nation? On November 22, 1963, shots echoed across Dealey Plaza. Within seconds, President John F. Kennedy was dead. The official story blamed one man, a lone gunman with a cheap rifle. But from the moment the first headlines hit, Americans sensed something was off. The bullet trajectories, missing witnesses, and vanishing evidence told a different story, one hidden deep within the corridors of power. Today, we're rediving into America's darkest conspiracy, the secret plot to kill JFK, to reveal who might have orchestrated and why. In the early afternoon of November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas, basked under a clear blue sky. Crowds gathered along Elm Street, waving flags and cheering as President John F. Kennedy's motorcade slowly made its way through Dealey Plaza. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, a day that symbolized hope, youth, and the promise of a new America. But in a matter of seconds, that hope was shattered by the crack of gunfire that would echo across history. The official story was simple. A lone gunman named Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. One bullet missed. The second hit both Kennedy and Governor John Connally. The third, the fatal shot, struck the president in the head. Within hours, the Dallas police declared Oswald the assassin. The media spread the story worldwide, and the nation accepted it. But almost immediately, people began to question how a single man with a cheap rifle could pull off such a precise, devastating attack. The cracks in the official story appeared fast. Witnesses in Dealey Plaza claimed they heard shots coming from multiple directions. Some pointed to the famous grassy knoll, where a puff of smoke was seen just as Kennedy was hit. Others reported hearing echoes from behind a wooden fence. Yet the Warren Commission, established to investigate the assassination, concluded there was no evidence of a second shooter. It was Oswald acting alone. But if that were true, why did so many eyewitnesses insist otherwise? The evidence itself told a different story. The so-called magic bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, was said to have passed through both Kennedy and Connally, shattering bones and emerging almost perfectly intact. Critics argued that was physically impossible. How could one bullet cause 7 wounds in 2 men and show no significant damage? The theory defied logic, yet it became the cornerstone of the government's explanation. It was as if the laws of physics had been rewritten to fit the narrative. Then there was the timing. The Zapruder film, the most important home video ever captured, recorded the entire sequence in horrifying detail. When analysts examined the footage, they noticed that the shots occurred too quickly for a single bolt-action rifle to be reloaded and fired 3 times with such deadly accuracy. Oswald's rifle, an Italian Carcano, was notoriously clunky and slow. Even the best marksmen struggled to match the timing under test conditions. So how did an average former Marine pull off what seemed mechanically impossible? As the investigation deepened, more inconsistencies emerged. Key witnesses were ignored or discredited. Autopsy photographs went missing. Medical reports contradicted the official findings. Some doctors at Parkland Hospital, who treated the president, described a massive wound in the back of his head, suggesting an exit wound from a shot fired from the front, not behind. Yet the Warren Commission insisted all shots came from the rear. The narrative was being shaped, not discovered. It didn't stop there. Just 2 days after the assassination, Oswald himself was gunned down in the basement of the Dallas Police Department by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner with known ties to organized crime. Millions watched live on television as the only suspect in the murder of a president was silenced forever. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. The man who could have told his side of the story was dead before he ever stood trial. And with him, any chance of learning the full truth died too. The official explanation began to feel less like an investigation and more like a cover story, a story crafted to calm a terrified nation and protect those in power. If Oswald was just a scapegoat, then who was really behind the assassination? The planning, precision, and coordination suggested something much bigger, a network of individuals who knew exactly where the motorcade would pass. how to manipulate the crime scene, and how to control the narrative afterward. From the moment Kennedy's motorcade turned onto Elm Street, everything seemed preordained. The slow turn, the open car, the lack of Secret Service agents on the back bumper, all these coincidences created the perfect window of vulnerability. Witnesses later testified that agents were told to stand down, that the route had been altered last minute, and that security in Dallas was unusually lax. Was this sheer incompetence, or was someone ensuring that the president would be exposed at the exact right moment? The more one examines the events of that day, the harder it becomes to believe this was just the act of a lone drifter seeking fame. This was precision. This was timing. This was choreography on a national stage. A plot that required coordination between shooters, spotters, and those who could manipulate the official record afterward. It was too perfect to be random, too controlled to be chaotic. When the smoke cleared in Dealey Plaza, the president was dead, the alleged assassin was silenced, and the machinery of government moved swiftly to declare the case closed. But behind the calm voices of officials and the glossy pages of the Warren Report lay a growing suspicion, feeling that something had gone terribly wrong, not just in Dallas, but in the heart of America itself. When President John F. Kennedy entered office in 1961, he inherited not only the power of the presidency, but also a hidden empire operating in the shadows, an intelligence network with global reach and almost no accountability, the Central Intelligence Agency. At first, Kennedy saw the CIA as an essential tool in America's fight against communism. But within months, that trust would shatter, and a quiet war would begin between the young president and the powerful agency that was supposed to serve him. The breaking point came with the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. The plan, originally crafted by the Eisenhower administration and executed under Kennedy, turned into a disaster. Hundreds of CIA-trained Cuban exiles were captured, the U.S. was humiliated, and the world saw Kennedy as weak. But behind closed doors, Kennedy realized something darker. The CIA had misled him. They had deliberately withheld key information, hoping to force his hand into approving a full-scale U.S. military invasion. When he refused, they let the operation fail and made sure he took the blame. Kennedy was furious. He felt betrayed by his own intelligence agency. Within days, he fired CIA Director Allen Dulles along with Deputy Director Charles Cabell and Richard Beasel, three of the most powerful men in Washington. It was a bold move, one that few presidents had ever dared to make. But what Kennedy might not have realized was that by challenging the CIA, he was threatening the very foundation of an organization that had become accustomed to operating above the law. From that moment on, Kennedy became a target of suspicion within the intelligence community. Declassified documents and testimony from insiders revealed that the CIA considered him a liability, a man who could expose covert operations and dismantle their influence. Kennedy had even told his aides privately that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. To some, in Washington, Kennedy was no longer a leader. He was a threat to the establishment. And threats in the world of espionage are neutralized. In the months before his death, intelligence reports indicate that the CIA maintained active files on Oswald's movements. Some officers even knew of his presence in Dallas days before the assassination, yet no warning was sent to the Secret Service. After the assassination, those same files vanished or were heavily redacted. When investigators tried to follow the paper trail, they encountered roadblocks, missing documents, and mysterious national security restrictions that prevented full disclosure. Even more alarming were the revelations years later, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations re-examined the case in the 1970s. They concluded there was a probable conspiracy and criticized the CIA for withholding crucial evidence. Former agents admitted under oath that the agency had not fully cooperated with the Warren Commission. It was as if the organization was hiding something that pointed to deeper involvement. Rumors spread about a covert project known as Operation Mongoose, a CIA-led campaign to assassinate Fidel Castro using hitmen, poison, and even mob connections. Kennedy had been briefed on these operations and was horrified by their methods. He wanted them shut down. But to many inside the agency, these missions were vital. Removing Castro was part of a larger Cold War strategy. If Kennedy was unwilling to play along, he was standing in the way of American power. Behind closed doors, whispers began circulating among intelligence circles. Kennedy's idealism was dangerous, his actions were unpredictable. His removal, some speculated, might restore the balance of power in Washington. And as history would later show, many of the same individuals Kennedy had fired or angered, men like Allen Dulles, found themselves in key roles overseeing the investigation into his death, shaping the very narrative the world would come to believe. In the smoky backrooms of Chicago and New Orleans, whispers about the Kennedy brothers had turned bitter. What had once been a powerful alliance between the Mafia and the political machine of the Kennedys had soured into open betrayal. For men who ruled through loyalty, silence, and favors, betrayal demanded a price, and in their world, that price was blood. When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he needed more than charisma and vision to win. Behind the scenes, powerful figures in organized crime had allegedly lent their influence to help swing key votes in Illinois and West Virginia. Chicago boss Sam Giancana and New Orleans kingpin Carlos Marcello were two names frequently whispered in political circles. They controlled unions, money, and muscle, the kind of power that could make or break elections. In return, they expected protection, business favors, and silence from the new administration. But once Kennedy took office, everything changed. Robert F. Kennedy, the president's younger brother and newly appointed Attorney General, declared war on organized crime. It was an unprecedented move. The Justice Department began investigating the very men who had helped them rise to power. RFK created a special task force, subpoenaing mob leaders, freezing assets, and bringing indictments that shook the underworld. The message was clear: the days of political protection were over. The Mafia, once untouchable, was now being hunted by the very family they had helped put in the White House. Sam Giancana reportedly fumed that the Kennedys had used him and then discarded him like trash. Carlos Marcello, a man known for his cold, calculating revenge, was even more enraged. In 1961, RFK had Marcello forcibly deported to Guatemala, dumping him in the middle of the jungle without warning. Marcello eventually made his way back into the United States, but the humiliation cut deep. Friends would later claim that from that moment he vowed to kill the Kennedy brothers, and not by himself. He would find a way to make the government feel the sting of betrayal. But the connections between the Mafia and the events leading up to November 22, 1963, run even deeper. The CIA, desperate to eliminate Fidel Castro after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, had reportedly turned to the Mafia for help. They needed men who could arrange assassinations without leaving a trace, and the mob had those skills. Giancana, Marcello, and Tampa boss Santo Trafficante were allegedly contacted by CIA intermediaries to plan Castro's murder. In exchange, the agency would turn a blind eye to their criminal enterprises. But when the Castro plots failed, and Kennedy's administration continued its anti-mafia crusade, those same mobsters found themselves double-crossed, not only by the government but by the president himself. Now imagine being in their position. The CIA had used them, the White House had betrayed them, and their profits were crumbling under federal pressure. The Mafia thrived on control, on payback, on restoring balance when respect was lost. What better way to strike back than to hit at the very heart of the Kennedy power, the president? Not through direct confrontation, but through the kind of careful orchestration they were famous for. Witness accounts and later investigations revealed that several individuals connected to organized crime appeared. In the orbit of Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby, Ruby, the nightclub owner who shot Oswald on live television, had deep ties to both the Chicago and Dallas underworld. He was known to have worked for mob-connected figures and regularly entertained corrupt lawmen, politicians, and low-level operatives. After killing Oswald, Ruby claimed he did it to spare Jackie Kennedy the pain of a trial, but those who knew him said otherwise. They believed he was silencing a loose end, acting on orders he didn't fully understand but couldn't refuse. Meanwhile, evidence suggests that Oswald himself may have crossed paths with individuals tied to Marcello's organization in New Orleans, where he had lived months before the assassination. The city was a hub of Mafia activity, and Marcello's influence there was absolute. Some researchers believe Oswald was being manipulated, a pawn in a much larger game, one designed to ensure that when the shots were fired, all eyes would focus on a single expendable man. The Mafia had motive, means, and connections, and more importantly, they had the networks to make something like the Dallas hit possible. Their reach extended into local police, corrupt politicians, and even parts of the intelligence community. They knew how to move money quietly, how to make witnesses disappear, and how to orchestrate chaos while keeping their hands clean. After the assassination, the FBI's silence on mob involvement was deafening. J. Edgar Hoover, who had long downplayed organized crime's existence, quickly endorsed the lone gunman theory. Yet Hoover himself had known about mafia operations for decades. Why the sudden reluctance to explore that angle? Some suggest Hoover's own vulnerabilities, his rumored connections to mob figures, and his obsession with maintaining control kept him from digging too deep. Then there were the strange coincidences that followed. Witnesses who claimed to have knowledge of mob involvement began dying in car accidents, shootings, or sudden illnesses. Files disappeared, and investigators were warned off pursuing leads that touched organized crime. The pattern felt familiar, like the way the Mafia cleaned up after a job, removing every trace until only a neat, believable story remained. To the public, it looked like justice had been served when Oswald was killed. But to those who knew the underworld's code, it was the final act in a carefully scripted performance. The mob never left witnesses alive, never left trails uncovered, and never forgave betrayal. For Giancana, Marcello, and Trafficante, the Kennedys had crossed the line. The way they saw it, this wasn't politics, this was payback. By 1963, President John F. Kennedy stood almost alone against one of the most powerful forces in the world. Not an enemy nation, but a system within his own country. It was a machine built on war, fueled by fear and driven by money, the military-industrial complex. It wasn't just the Pentagon, it wasn't just defense contractors. It was an entire network of generals, politicians, spies, and corporations whose wealth and power depended on the continuation of global conflict. And Kennedy, with his calls for peace and nuclear disarmament, had become their greatest threat. The warning about this shadow empire didn't come from Kennedy, it came from his predecessor, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his farewell address in 1961. Eisenhower, a former five-star general, cautioned Americans to beware the growing influence of the military-industrial complex. He feared that the massive buildup of arms and defense spending during the Cold War would one day override democratic control. It was a chilling prophecy, one that would come true just 2 years later. When Kennedy took office, the Cold War was at its peak. The U.S. and the Soviet Union were locked in a deadly arms race, each building bigger bombs and stronger armies. Defense companies like Lockheed, General Dynamics, and Boeing were making billions supplying weapons. The military budget had ballooned to unprecedented levels. And behind the scenes, military leaders believed war was inevitable and profitable. But Kennedy didn't share their view. He saw the arms race as madness, a spiral that could end the world in nuclear annihilation. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, 13 days that brought humanity to the brink of extinction. While generals urged Kennedy to launch an airstrike and invade Cuba, he chose negotiation. He secretly communicated with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and found a peaceful resolution that pulled both nations back from the edge. The world saw it as Kennedy's greatest victory, but within the corridors of the Pentagon, many saw it as weakness. They believed he had surrendered to the Soviets. In their eyes, Kennedy was not a hero, he was a liability. After the crisis, Kennedy's relationship with the military grew colder. He began to speak openly about reducing nuclear weapons and limiting U.S. intervention overseas. He signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first major step toward arms control. And he spoke of a future where America and the Soviet Union could coexist without war. To the generals, to the defense contractors, to those who thrived on conflict that was unacceptable, peace was bad for business. The most controversial decision of all came with Vietnam. In October 1963, Kennedy approved National Security Action Memorandum 263, which called for the withdrawal of 1,000 U.S. military personnel from Vietnam, the first step in a full withdrawal by 1965. He had seen enough. He didn't want another endless war fought on foreign soil. He wanted to bring American troops home. But for the military-industrial establishment, Vietnam represented the next gold rush. Billions in contracts, weapons, and logistics depended on escalation. Kennedy's decision threatened that entire structure. Behind closed doors, the frustration among military and intelligence leaders reached a breaking point. They viewed Kennedy as naive, too idealistic to handle the realities of global power. In their world, diplomacy didn't win wars, force did, and they believed the only way to secure America's dominance was through perpetual strength, not compromise. To them, Kennedy's vision of peace was not inspiring, it was dangerous. After the assassination, Kennedy's withdrawal plan was immediately reversed. Within months, the Johnson administration signed National Security Action Memorandum 273, expanding America's role in Vietnam. The war machine roared back to life, and over the next decade, more than 58,000 Americans would die, along with millions of Vietnamese civilians. Defense contractors made record profits. Generals won promotions. The machine that Kennedy had tried to stop was running at full speed again. But the timing of that reversal raised disturbing questions. How could the new policy have been drafted so quickly after the president's death? Some historians believe it had been prepared in advance, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the one man standing in the way to be removed. Kennedy had become a threat not through betrayal or ideology, but through his refusal to feed the endless appetite of war. There were other moments, quieter ones, that revealed the depth of Kennedy's break with the military establishment. During a meeting in 1962, when his generals pressed him to use nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union, Kennedy reportedly stormed out, saying, "And we call ourselves the human race." To men trained to fight and win at all costs, that kind of moral restraint was weakness. To them, Kennedy didn't understand power. He didn't understand the game. But perhaps he understood it too well, and that's what made him dangerous. Many of Kennedy's speeches during his final months sounded almost prophetic. He spoke about peace not as an abstract dream, but as a practical necessity for survival. In his famous American University address, he urged Americans to re-examine their attitudes toward the Soviet Union and recognize their shared humanity. It was a call to end the Cold War mindset, to stop viewing the world as a battlefield divided by ideology. But those words, while inspiring to millions, sent shockwaves through Washington's military and defense networks. They saw in his tone not optimism but betrayal. The deeper Kennedy pushed for peace, the more isolated he became. The very agencies that were supposed to protect him, the CIA, the Pentagon, even elements within his own administration, were filled with men who believed his policies endangered America's supremacy. To them, Kennedy wasn't saving the world. He was dismantling it piece by piece. And as the pressure mounted, it began to feel less like political disagreement and more like a silent revolt, a struggle between a president seeking peace and an establishment built on war. In the chaotic hours after the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza, confusion quickly gave way to control. Within minutes, a narrative began to take shape, one that pointed to a single gunman, a single motive, and a simple explanation for one of the most complex crimes in American history. It was the birth of the lone assassin theory, and from that moment forward, every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every question that didn't fit would be buried, twisted, or erased. At Parkland Hospital, where doctors fought desperately to save Kennedy's life, chaos reigned. But among the doctors, some noticed something strange, a massive wound at the back of the president's head, consistent with a shot from the front. They described it in detail to reporters and in early medical notes. But later, when the official autopsy was conducted at Bethesda Naval Hospital under military supervision, those observations were ignored. The autopsy photos that could have clarified everything went missing. The doctor's statements were altered. And the final report declared all shots came from behind. The story had been rewritten before it even began. The Warren Commission, established just days later, was presented as an independent investigation. But behind the scenes, it was anything but. Its members included men deeply tied to the very institutions that stood to lose the most if the truth came out. Chief among them was Allen Dulles, the former CIA director fired by Kennedy himself after the Bay of Pigs disaster. Now he was sitting on the commission tasked with investigating the murder of the man who had dismissed him. To many, that alone was proof that the investigation was never meant to reveal the truth, only to protect it. Witnesses who contradicted the official version of events began to vanish or change their stories. More than 50 people connected to the case would die under suspicious circumstances. In the years following the assassination, some were found shot, others in car accidents. A few simply disappeared. The odds of that happening by coincidence were astronomical. Yet, every time another witness died, the official story grew stronger because there was one less voice to challenge it. Then there was the evidence itself, conveniently misplaced, destroyed, or hidden under the guise of national security. The president's limousine, which was the most crucial crime scene of all, was immediately cleaned and repaired before investigators could fully examine it. The blood-stained seats were replaced, bullet fragments disappeared. The chain of custody for key pieces of evidence was broken repeatedly. Even Oswald's rifle, the infamous Carcano, was handled by so many people before testing that it was impossible to determine whether it had fired the fatal shots. In the media, the story unfolded exactly as the authorities wanted. Newspapers printed headlines declaring Oswald the lone killer within hours of his arrest. Television networks repeated the same talking points. The idea of a conspiracy was dismissed as paranoia before the investigation even began. The power of repetition turned speculation into certainty. And when Jack Ruby killed Oswald live on national television, it sealed the narrative forever. The patsy was dead. The story was closed. But some people refused to stay silent. Journalists, doctors, and witnesses who spoke out about inconsistencies found themselves targeted. Careers were destroyed. Files were classified for decades. When the public asked questions, they were met with silence. When researchers pressed for documents, they were told the truth could not be revealed for national security reasons. It was as if the system itself had decided that the American people didn't deserve to know what really happened. Over the years, declassified documents have exposed how deep the manipulation ran. The CIA launched a program in 1967 known as Operation Mockingbird to influence journalists and discredit critics of the Warren Report. The term conspiracy theorist was weaponized to mock anyone who questioned the official line. Public skepticism was painted as unpatriotic, even dangerous. The same intelligence apparatus accused of hiding the truth now controlled the very narrative meant to protect it. The autopsy photographs, the medical records, the ballistics data, all were locked away in government archives, sealed for 75 years. Why? What could possibly be so sensitive about a murder investigation that it needed to be hidden from the public for nearly a century? That question lingered for decades, haunting generations of Americans who sensed they were being lied to by the very institutions meant to protect them. And then came the mysterious deaths, the ripple effect of silence. Dorothy Kilgallen, the respected journalist who interviewed Jack Ruby and claimed she had uncovered explosive information about the assassination, was found dead in her apartment in 1965. Her notes were missing. William Pitzer, a Navy officer who allegedly filmed Kennedy's autopsy, died of an apparent suicide just before he was set to retire. Dozens of others met similar fates, all linked by one thread. They had something to say about Dallas, and they never got the chance to say it. Even decades later, as the government slowly began releasing classified files, the story didn't add up. Pages were redacted, names were blacked out, and connections were hidden beneath layers of secrecy. Every document seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Why did intelligence agencies have files on Oswald long before the assassination? Why did the FBI monitor his every move but fail to prevent him from getting close to the president? And why, even today, are some of those files still withheld from the public? From the start, it was never just about one man with a rifle. It was about control of the truth, control of the narrative, control of history itself. Every press conference, every report, every carefully chosen phrase was part of a calculated effort to make sure the American people never looked too deep, never asked too many questions, never saw the connections that led beyond Oswald and into the heart of the system. The cover-up wasn't just a reaction to chaos. It was the final stage of the plan. The perfect crime wasn't the assassination itself. It was the story built afterward. The illusion of clarity. The comfort of closure. The deliberate rewriting of history that allowed those responsible to walk free, their power intact, their secrets buried in sealed vaults marked classified. The story of John F. Kennedy's assassination has always been told as a tragedy, but beneath the sorrow lies something far darker. A truth so complex, so tangled, that even today it threatens the foundations of trust in the American system. To understand who really killed JFK, you have to look beyond the smoke in Dealey Plaza, beyond the rifle in the Texas School Book Depository, and into the invisible corridors of power where politics, greed, and fear converge. Because this wasn't the work of a single madman, it was the convergence of multiple forces, each with its own motive, each with something to gain from Kennedy's death. By the autumn of 1963, Kennedy had made enemies in nearly every corner of the establishment. Inside the CIA, he was seen as a traitor who wanted to dismantle their empire. Within the military, he was accused of weakening America's position by refusing to invade Cuba or escalate the war in Vietnam. To organized crime, he was a double-crosser, a man who took their help to win an election and then turned his brother loose to destroy them. And to the corporate titans of the defense industry, he was an obstacle to endless profits. One man, surrounded by adversaries who each saw his death as the solution to their problem. The brilliance of the plot wasn't in its execution, it was in its coordination. Each group didn't need to know every detail of what the others were doing. They only needed a shared objective: remove Kennedy and protect their interests. Somewhere in that web of power, the decision was made. The hit would take place in Dallas, a city known for its deep ties to oil, intelligence, and anti-Kennedy sentiment. The groundwork was laid carefully, quietly, long before November 22nd. Lee Harvey Oswald became the perfect pawn. His background was tailor-made for manipulation, a defector to the Soviet Union, a supposed communist sympathizer, yet with strange connections to pro-American intelligence operatives. He was the ideal fall guy, someone who could be painted as both a leftist fanatic and a loner desperate for recognition. His movements in the weeks before the assassination read like the path of a man being guided, not acting on his own. He was seen handing out pro-Castro flyers one day and meeting anti-Castro agents the next. A man in two worlds, neither of which he truly belonged to. When the shots were fired in Dealey Plaza, chaos followed. But amidst the confusion, something remarkable happened. The narrative snapped into place almost instantly. Within an hour, the police had Oswald in custody. Within days, the media declared him guilty. It was as if the script had already been written. Oswald himself protested, shouting to reporters, "I'm just a patsy." Those three words still echo through history like a warning. And then, before he could speak again, Jack Ruby stepped in and silenced him forever. But Ruby's story only deepened the mystery. His nightclub connections, his ties to the Dallas underworld, his relationships with corrupt lawmen all pointed to an organized network, not a random act of vengeance. He claimed he killed Oswald out of patriotism to spare Jackie Kennedy the pain of a trial. But witnesses reported Ruby meeting with mob associates days before the shooting. His finances showed sudden unexplained deposits. And in prison, he hinted repeatedly that the truth about Kennedy's death went far beyond one man. Years later, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the investigation, their conclusion shocked the nation. There was, they said, a probable conspiracy, yet even that admission came buried under layers of uncertainty. The evidence that might have connected the dots, files on Oswald, CIA communications, records of military meetings, mob surveillance logs, were either missing, destroyed, or classified. Every trail ended in the same place: silence. As more documents trickled out over the decades, the picture became clearer, not simpler. The CIA had monitored Oswald months before the shooting. The Mafia had expressed open hatred for the Kennedys. The Pentagon had plans for expanded operations in Vietnam that were signed within days of Kennedy's death. Each revelation added another piece to a puzzle that seemed deliberately unsolvable. It wasn't just about who pulled the trigger. It was about who had the power to make the truth disappear. When you look at the assassination through that lens, the question shifts from who killed Kennedy to why he had to die. He was dismantling the structures that made certain men rich, powerful, and untouchable. He was pulling back the curtain on covert wars, refusing to bow to the pressures of the intelligence state, and daring to challenge the endless cycle of profit through conflict. For those invested in maintaining control, Kennedy's vision of peace was more dangerous than any enemy abroad. And so they created a myth, the myth of the lone gunman. It gave the public closure, it gave the government stability. It gave history a convenient villain. But behind that myth was a coalition of interests, a hidden hand guiding the outcome long before the shots were fired. Whether it was the CIA's operatives, the Mafia's enforcers, the military's planners, or the corporations that stood to gain, the assassination was not chaos, it was control, disguised as tragedy. Even today, as classified files continue to be released in fragments, the full picture remains obscured. Names are redacted, timelines are altered. Evidence is withheld under the guise of national security. It's as if the truth itself is still considered too dangerous to reveal. The fingerprints of power are everywhere, but no single culprit can ever be isolated, because that's how the system was designed, compartmentalized, deniable, untouchable. In the end, Kennedy's assassination wasn't just the killing of a president, it was the silencing of a vision. A warning to all who might come after him that true reform, true independence, carries a price. It was America's turning point, the moment when idealism collided with the machinery of hidden power and lost. The echoes of that day still linger, a shadow over every unanswered question, every locked file, every whisper that dares to ask not just how Kennedy died, but who among the living made sure his truth would never be told. For over 6 decades, the assassination of John F. Kennedy has stood as the ultimate riddle, a mystery buried beneath official reports, sealed files, and generations of unanswered questions. But as we've peeled back the layers of this story, one thing becomes undeniable. The pieces don't fit the official narrative. What was presented to the public as a lone act of madness begins to look less like chance and more like orchestration, a perfect storm of power, politics, and control. From the very start, the Warren Commission's lone gunman theory was meant to give America closure. Yet every fact we've uncovered, every witness silenced, every file destroyed, every contradiction ignored, only deepens the cracks in that fragile illusion. It wasn't just a crime of opportunity, it was a crime of intent. A plot born in the shadows, carried out by forces that understood how to hide in plain sight. Think back to the early 1960s. A nation standing on the edge of transformation. Kennedy was young, bold, and unafraid to challenge the establishment. He defied the CIA after the Bay of Pigs. He questioned the Federal Reserve. He spoke openly about peace when the world was preparing for war. He threatened the profits of the defense industry by planning to pull troops from Vietnam. And he angered the Mafia by cracking down on organized crime through his brother, Robert. In every direction, Kennedy was closing doors that powerful people wanted left open. And then, in one violent instant, everything changed. The man who promised a new frontier fell in a storm of bullets, and the dream of a different America fell with him. Those responsible ensured that no single thread could ever be pulled without unraveling the entire system. Lee Harvey Oswald became the perfect distraction, a convenient villain, a manufactured narrative. But the truth never died with him. It lived on in the whispers of agents, in the confessions of mobsters, in the buried documents stamped classified for generations. The cover-up was as calculated as the assassination itself. Files vanished, witnesses died, reporters were threatened, and America moved on because it had to. The illusion of stability was more important than the reality of truth. Yet behind that illusion, the same forces that Kennedy tried to confront, the intelligence networks, the corporate war machines, the criminal alliances, grew stronger, quieter, more untouchable. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that Kennedy's death was not just about one man. It was about a message. A warning to every leader who might dare to challenge the invisible hand that guides the course of nations. A signal that the presidency itself is not the seat of power, it is only its public face. The real decisions are made behind locked doors by those who never stand for election and never fear the ballot box. In the years that followed, America changed. The Vietnam War escalated, the Cold War deepened. The surveillance state expanded. Everything Kennedy had tried to prevent came to pass. His death didn't just alter history, it redirected it. It set the course for decades of secrecy, distrust, and hidden agendas that still shape the world today. But perhaps the most haunting part of this story is not what we know. It asks what we still don't. Thousands of files remain sealed. Key evidence remains missing. And every time the government promises transparency, it arrives in fragments, redacted, incomplete, carefully curated to maintain the myth. It's as if the truth itself is considered too dangerous for the public to handle, or perhaps too revealing for the powerful to survive. So we're left to wonder, what really happened in Dallas that day? Was it a coup from within, orchestrated by those sworn to protect? Was it revenge from the underworld Kennedy betrayed? Or was it the moment the unseen empire revealed its strength by silencing the one man who refused to bow to it? Whatever the answer, one truth remains uncheckable. John F. Kennedy's assassination was more than the end of a presidency. It was the beginning of America's modern conspiracy age. It marked the moment when the public stopped believing everything they were told and began questioning the stories that power demanded they accept. And maybe that's the real legacy of JFK's death. Not just the loss of a leader, but the birth of doubt, the awakening of a nation to the shadows that linger behind its brightest ideals. Because if the most powerful man in the world could be silenced, and the truth buried for generations, then what else might still be hidden from view? The story of John F. Kennedy's assassination isn't over. It's still being written piece by piece. Every time another secret is revealed, every time someone dares to ask the forbidden question. The question that echoes across decades, not just who killed JFK, but why was the truth never meant to be known?